All right, everybody, we're getting ready to start a new project. This project is going to be quite a bit different than the last ones. We're going to move away from a focus on still lives and start focusing on composition. And so, in order to do that, we're going to look at the principles and elements of design, and we're going to focus this week on one of the more important elements of design, that is line. Okay, so we're going to look at what line is and how it can impact the emotional quality or expression of a composition. So let's start by looking at the fact that line can be a line in itself. We look at the far left image here. Here is a line, and it's kind of moving down the image, and it's starting to form a contour. But for the most part, when you look at that, you just see a line, as we might understand a line to be, simply a line moving in a direction, kind of moving across the page. So then when we look at the second image, we see how a line can actually contain a form. It can become the outer contour of a form and define the shape of the form. And that would, again, that starts to look more like a representational form. And then the line can actually then be used to imply the transition, across the form between the light and dark side. So defining where that transition is an implied line. Okay, there isn't actually a line there. There'll usually be a soft, fuzzy transition between the light and dark side, depending on whether it's a sharp or a soft transition from the light to the dark side. In the case of something like a pear, it would be a softer transition, so the line would be more implied than it would be emphatically there. Then there's the idea of the implied line of the cross contours, which again move, basically around the form, giving a sense of how the form might actually move three-dimensionally in space. This is what you might consider a wireframe model, where the lines are moving across the longitude and latitude of the form and moving. Again, these are things that you would create in a sense if you were trying to feel how that form would move three-dimensionally in space. So again, we have just a basic line for the line itself, the line that forms a contour, defining the shape of a form. Then we have implied lines that we use to identify where transitions happen in the form. And then another type of implied line that helps us identify how that form moves three-dimensionally in space. Now there's three types of lines when you think about, there's horizontal and vertical lines. And those are lines that we know implicitly or instinctively, because when you see a line that's perfectly vertical or horizontal, it feels stable and it feels like it's static and unmoving. As soon as a line starts to move to one side or the other of that, moving at an angle, that's what we call a diagonal line. Now, diagonal lines are more active. They imply movement, and they will create a sense of energy and dynamics in a composition that animates the space. And also, a diagonal line, they're a harder line, and they feel that's what you might use to create a sense of strength, as well as a sense of energy in the form. So curvilinear lines are also dynamic, they're also energetic, but they have a more flowing quality to it. So curvilinear lines are more or less what you might call a line of beauty, sort of the S shape. You have the ovals, balls, anything like that that's curvilinear. So that's going to have a softer flow to it than the more dynamic, more masculine lines of the diagonals. So when I say an implied line, when you actually see things in the real world, there aren't lines. Lines don't actually exist in the world. That's a concept developed by man to describe what they're seeing in the world. So we see things that seem like lines, where one edge, like if you look at the upper left corner here, you have a white box with light gray and then a darker gray rectangles, and where they meet, it appears to create a line. Okay, that's just basically where two tones come up to one another at a straight edge. So that is what we would be able to define as a line, but it's actually just a shift of tone at that edge. So it's more, lines are really representational of edges. Okay, so if you look to the right, you'll see a figure that's drawn in a representational way where light and dark occurs, where the form turns away from the light And if there's a sharp turn away from the light, you go from a very light area to a very dark area immediately. If there's a soft turn, there's generally a shift from the light to a lighter tone of gray and then a darker tone of gray. So it's more of a subtle transition from light to dark. So depending on how sharp the transition is, there's either an implied line or a fairly clear line of separation. When you're looking at this, again, more representational image of a photograph of a statue where you're seeing the gradations from light to the dark side, it's a little tricky to see where that transition points would be. So I actually put it in Illustrator, and it gave me a readout of how it saw the light and dark transitions from in a 4-value transition from the light to the light gray to darker gray to black. And you can see there's a stronger implied line where that transition is. And that's one of the things when you're actually creating form, you can actually play with how you define those transition points between tones, and how soft or fuzzy they're going to be, or how hard they're going to be, and you can actually get very creative with how you work with those type of spaces and the implied lines between the transitions. Now another implied line is when you have lines stop at a point and they make you feel like they're actually stopping at a form. So a form is implied in this particular image where you have two rectangles crossing each other and what appears to be a white square in front of them. But the white square doesn't have any borders, it's just basically implied where those lines stop. And your mind kind of fills in the box. It creates the box because it thinks there should be one there. So it almost feels like you can see the edges of the box when actually they aren't really there. So that same idea plays out. Actually, let's look at this one because it really plays out more in this image. Because here's a Frank Miller where he's using that exact idea where he has lines stop where there should be a board crossing the front doorway to this barn. And so on the door, there's these lines that are going straight down and then stopping at the point where there should be a heavy bar going across. And rather than drawing it, he left it white. And the reason he did that is he wanted it to feel really stark. And so by leaving it pure white and not even have a line towards the edge of the outline, it actually makes the composition seem even starker and brighter. And so it intensifies the scene by actually not drawing the form. And so that's a really interesting way of defining the form and actually giving sort of an emotional charge to the space. Now again, line can be, just by changing direction, can imply space. Here you have horizontal and vertical lines. They change direction along a diagonal and create a kind of a V shape that makes you feel like you're moving forward or backward in space. But all it really is flat two-dimensional lines just changing direction along a diagonal line. So a very interesting illusion. Well, and what we're going to do in this composition is we're going to play with how these different types of lines can generate a feeling of emotion. So here are a bunch of thumbnail sketches, which thumbnail sketch is a very small sketch where you play out your ideas and you do it very quickly so you can kind of get a sense of how you might use that idea and what might happen with it in a very quick sketch. This shouldn't take you more than a couple of minutes per sketch. And then what I would like you to do is actually do like maybe 2 of each, just using horizontal lines to try and express the emotion, vertical lines to try and express an emotion, and diagonal lines. Now, the emotion that I want you to express, I want you to stop for a minute and write down an emotion. Okay, I want you to write down whatever emotion comes to your mind, write it down, and then take a moment to try and define it. Okay, when I'm done with this, you can continue with that. But I want you to get a written description of it, and then start doing some thumbnail sketches where you play with that. You play with the different types of lines that you can use, and then see which one really seems to more effectively convey that emotion, right? Because that's actually going to be the concept for your project this week. You're actually going to create a project based on an emotion, the emotion that you just wrote down, and then you're going to create a composition that conveys that emotion. This is just another example of some different quick sketch ideas that were developed to show you how horizontal and vertical lines can be used. And then also in the bottom, the third row and the bottom row, you can see some use of negative space. Negative space is really important in composition because it allows some shapes to stand out and other space to push back. So as important as the positive shapes are, a lot of times the negative spaces can be as critical and sometimes even more important for the emotional impact, because it can help to separate areas, define space, and really generate a sense of kind of an overall emotional impact of the composition by what's happening in that space behind the shapes. So here's a real simple way that you can create compositional concepts by just using the lines that you find in letters. Okay, so like the top left one, you see the letter T. The vertical line becomes the figure. The horizontal line is the horizon line. So in each one of these little compositions, you can see how that shape helped to generate how the forms were placed in the composition. Because honestly, we get in a rut of kind of placing things in the same place and working with compositions a lot in the same way. So this is a way to break that up and kind of play with using a simple line that you might find in a form like a letter to help to set how you'd actually organize a composition. Now, another thing you need to do generally in a composition is think about the visual movement, okay? How you want the viewer to move into the scene, and you do that by gesture, okay? So what you see on the left little compositions is lines, okay? Those lines represent gestural movement in the composition, and then the figures are set in alignment with that energy and that flow. And so before you even start actually drawing details and form, you want to get a sense of the energy, and you do that by generating gestural lines that will set how the forms will actually move through the spaces in the composition. You'll see that here. I have a figure, a dancing figure, and when you look at the figure, you get a feel for where the energy is, where the dynamic movement is. So if I were to actually start drawing this, the first thing I would do would be to indicate what I would call the power, the dynamic force in a line, okay? And then I'm going to build on that line. The first line would have been the one from, the bottom of the chin down through the body and out the leg to the right. The second line I probably would have drawn would have been from the center down through the left leg down to the floor, moving and getting that sense of energy and dynamics, and then building on that. Then I would put in more lines that follow the other kind of strong senses of force and movement in the figure, down around the leg, across the hip, around the chest, and then across the arms, and then the circular movement of the head at the top. So the initial lines might look something like this. Now this was done in Illustrator, so it's not as fluid as it might be if I was just freehanding it, but I just want to give you a sense of the sort of underlying movement that you're going to generate first, and then start to build form on that movement. So we'll look at a couple of compositions. Here we have one where the lines are clearly curvilinear for the most part, and it gives you a strong sense of flowing, almost like either air or water moving across the composition, with contrasting areas, lighter and darker, shifts in tone. And then, a couple of details like the grass, drawing your attention, it being anomalies within the composition. And then you have the dragonflies, and the dragonflies are actually basically diagonals. There's the straight line of the body, and then the sort of X-like wings that are cutting across it in a diagonal. So there are some different lines. For the most part, there's curvilinear lines with a few more angular lines thrown in there to give it a little contrast. Similar things happening here with the Van Gogh, where you have the curvilinear brushstrokes on circular movements throughout most of the composition. And that's balanced out by the strong vertical of the tree kind of coming up on the left-hand side, and then of the church more towards the center. And then there are there's a strong sense of a horizontal line across the whole bottom of the composition, and then some smaller horizontal verticals in the the houses in the bottom right of the composition. But for the most part, this composition has a very peaceful, flowing quality to it because of the curvilinear lines. Now here we have a very dynamic composition by Kandinsky where he's using all three types of lines, but the main dynamic lines are an upside down V, kind of a V, kind of moving from the upper and upper right and left down towards the center, and then from the bottom up there's a triangle moving that's almost in the center, and that's set almost like a wire hanging frame of a horizontal and vertical coming up from just right of center. So then you have all these curvilinear lines creating contrast to the diagonal lines, and so there, this is kind of a very playful, fun way of using all these different types of lines, and then having some stronger gesture lines to organize it all and give it a sense of more of a, not so much control, but a sense of organization. I had these two images I thought were interesting, two very different. There's a Picasso and then on the left and a Miro on the right. And the Picasso, the lines are very heavy and cartoonish, but they have a strong sense of form. So they're as much as they are lines, they are almost shapes as well. So he's using lines in a very calligraphy kind of way where he's going thin to thick, some lines having a lot more weight and giving more emphasis, some lines being different colors. So the primary thing that he's working with is line, lines in the backgrounds and the diagonals in the background, the curvilinear lines, the figure, and then the even the lines and the patterns across the figures and the clothing, what would appear to be the clothing of the figures. So again, but these lines have almost a heavy, clunky feel to them, and even though they're curvilinear, they don't have the same kind of light, flowing feeling that the ones in the Miro do to the right. Here you have a very fine lines that are flowing throughout the composition. A lot of variation in form. A lot of different shapes that are basically lined up on these lines. And so even though these shapes are kind of all over the place, the lines that are flowing through them actually tie them all together and give a sense of some sort of real organic forms that are being created that are almost translucent. And then in the background you have this very soft atmospheric space created by gradation that also softens the overall feel of the composition. So again, on the left you have Picasso, whose image is somewhat cartoonish, and it seems kind of heavy and clunky. Then you have on the right you have the Miro, whose image is also cartoonish to a certain extent, but it has a much softer, more melodic feel to it. Okay, so again, the emotional impact of the quality of line really makes a difference in these two compositions. Now here I thought this was kind of funny because it has these kind of contrasting modern artists. You have an image of a Matisse on the left, the portrait of a woman in black and white, and then on the right you have a Mondrian. It's just basically horizontal and vertical lines with squares and a triad color scheme with just yellow, red, and blue. So, and then they're both in squares, that form a rectangle against another rectangle that's a big green rectangle in the background with another rectangle of yellow. And then in front of that there is what appears to be a therapy chair, somebody that might be sitting in therapy. So you get a sense that you're in a psychiatrist's office, and these images in the background are conveying some kind of idea about someone who might sit in this chair. There seems to be this pensive woman in the Matisse image, and then she seems to be contemplating the modern piece of art. And then the lines in the bottom of the image kind of and the perspective of the chair move you towards the center. So the line here again, it's somewhat playful and interesting, and again, as much as you have the sort of static horizontal and verticals that are here, there's the dynamics of the diagonals moving you towards the center of the composition, and then sort of the interesting portrait of the woman there, kind of giving you something to contemplate in the composition. So, all right, so let's move on to the next one. And this is the last one that I had, and this one I thought it was kind of interesting because you have this very active background. You have these radiating diagonals in the very background with the pink and the red. Then you have this, breaking wave with mostly curvilinear lines, curving down towards the bottom of the painting, and then a curve, across the whole painting with the light blue, and the sort of energetic bubbles coming down on the left. And then you have the figure in the foreground. So the figure, as much as there's some curvilinear feel to it, for the most part, he's rendered in very angular strokes. And they're kind of heavier, strong strokes, so it gives you this feeling of masculinity and dynamics. But then the one final sort of odd thing about it was that here he is, he's standing almost perfectly straight up and sort of facing, his shoulders kind of squaring off with the line of the canvas. So you have basically a horizontal and vertical line there, giving him a sort of sense of stability, a sense of stability against this very chaotic background. So I just thought it was an interesting contrast. So, so the projects that you're going to be doing this week, I want you to start thinking about that emotion. Okay, write down the emotion. The projects you're going to be doing are going to be on Bristol board. You're going to be working in black and white with Sharpie markers. I put some information about the supplies that you're going to be needing, and for the next two projects, you're primarily going to need, well, the next couple of maybe 3 or 4 projects, you're going to be needing these, the ultrafine, the fine, and the chisel Sharpies, and you're going to need Bristol board paper, and that's primarily it for those projects, except for, I guess in, not this project, but the next one, you're also going to need a circle template. So that's all I got for you tonight, and take a look at this, and I'll talk with you guys later, okay?